Arsenal and Newcastle United overperforming, Chelsea and Manchester City underperforming, to say nothing of how you describe what happened with Manchester United and Tottenham last season in dismal 24-25 campaigns. Aston Villa, meanwhile, maybe performing to par, which you could also say maybe of champions Liverpool, except for the fact that they are the champions, so you'd never describe champions as just performing to par in that way. These are the main takeaways from my reading of the annual Deloitte Football Money League, which was published on Thursday morning. Now, usually the focus from this, which has become a kind of a big event in football business, I suppose, is about kind of the financial power of clubs, what it says in that regard. No Premier League teams in the top four there as regards revenue. But I actually always think it's most interesting in terms of what it says about team performance as related to wages, because this is the first major publication that reveals the wages of the major side over a given season. It's always in the previous campaign, obviously, because it's dependent on when accounts are published. And Deloitte have early access to some of the major clubs through European competition, because these figures come from the accounts that UEFA require to compete in Champions League, Europa Conference. And that is specifically relevant because of something I've written a lot about in The Independent. And it's something people don't really like to talk about because it takes away maybe some of the magic of the game, reduces it a bit to an equation. But it's there, it's relevant to why, say, Crystal Palace's joy from last season has been so quickly crushed by everyone trying to take their players and their manager. And that is that 4 decades of academic research basically shows this, that there is a 90% correlation between your wage bill and where you finish in the table. So basically, if you have the 5th highest wage bill, you should be finishing 5th in the table. Again, that's from decades of research. It's been borne out so many times. And the remaining 10% is where basically teams underperform or overperform. Manchester United and Tottenham from last season certainly know a fair bit about underperforming. More of that in a moment. Now, just as regards the figures, you should see them flash up on the screen. I've got the kind of my main takedowns or my main takeaways from those numbers. Some allowances have to be made. For one, as Deloitte say themselves in the research, that some figures have to be rounded up, some have to be rounded down. There are some estimations in there. And also there are some caveats because certain clubs publish their figures in different ways to others. So, for example, Liverpool, who are currently top of the list on 421 million, that wage bill, which is also unprecedented in recent times that Liverpool will be top. But it's become kind of standard discussion at this time that Liverpool always include their entire staff and employees in this figure, whereas most clubs in their accounts there is a differentiation between that and the playing figure. So we're able to actually more pointedly compare your player wages and where you finish in the league. So given Liverpool have bonuses as well for winning the title, it's possible that their figures could be anything from 5 million to 20 million lower, which would take them below Manchester City into second. So City are behind Liverpool now in second at estimated 390 million a year. That's been the first moment in some time that City haven't been first. Chelsea third, 353. United fourth, 340 is the estimation there. All that has gone down since, we know. Arsenal 338. Villa 268, Tottenham Hotspur 249, Newcastle 238. As for a lot of the rest of the clubs, including others who are now in Europe this season, like Nottingham Forest, we have to wait for the full account. So we can't really say how much they've overperformed and underperformed. But the main takeaway, I mean, if you're going by the simple measure of where you are on the wage list and where you are in the table, or where you were in the table, because this is, of course, about 24-25, well, Arsenal and Newcastle are the obvious underperformers. Newcastle up 3 places. There is one caveat there as well, because as brilliantly as Eddie Howe has done on the job, they didn't have European football last season. And as we know, and as is a discussion this season, and as we're going to discuss with Villa as well, given the modern calendar, given the schedule, given how a wage bill also allows you a deeper squad, if you don't have European football, it greatly helps. So ultimately, there is an argument that Newcastle not being in Europe and Villa being in Europe was the difference between 5th and 6th. I think one of the more interesting ones here that probably will also provoke the most debate is Arsenal. Because obviously over the last few years, the main emphasis with Arsenal has been transfer fees and how much they spent there. And let's be fair, I've actually discussed this in a previous video back in September. there is almost this perception that Arteta's tried to spend his way to success and hasn't yet succeeded. I've always argued against that because that expenditure is in the wider context, which is ultimately other clubs are spending more over the longer term, and also that wage bill is the most relevant figure of all. And for some time, the gap is beginning to close now, but Arsenal did have a significantly lower wage bill than all of Liverpool, Manchester City, Chelsea and Manchester United. So really this is about the fourth season in a row where I would say Arsenal have drastically overperformed. They've gone from they're fifth in the wage bill list to second in the table for the third year in a row. But that actually is overperformance if you look at it in these terms. Now, obviously, one of Arsenal's responses to this is they've gone to deepen the squad. So a little bit like with Liverpool and that jump they made to the title, I would expect Arsenal's wage bill to go up significantly for next year, when I suppose they have their best chance in a title in some time, which offers an explanation. Whether it would fully close the gap of, what is it, 60 million, 70 million to City and Liverpool, I think that's still a little bit unlikely. Let's see though. But for the moment, it does show overperformance. But of course, I mean, one of the bigger elements of this whole discussion is that football is the balance sheet only translates to football in a certain degree. What you're often paying for is, of course, that X factor, to use a cliche, but those extra details that do actually get you over the line. And I suppose that leads me into one of the more interesting elements here as well, which is Villa's place in this. Now, I should say first of all, Unai Emery has done an exceptional job at Villa. They drastically overperformed before this, and also they had the caveat of Champions League football last season, which obviously affected the schedule, especially with a more shallow squad than others. And obviously there's been a big debate around the financial rules and PSR around this. But I think it's interesting that just as you get to this moment of Villa, we're expecting to maybe push on a level despite restrictions in the summer, and as they lie right now in third in the table, they were sixth in the wage bill list last season, which is a little bit of a surprise, I'd say. And they're sixth in the table. That's par performance. And there is, I suppose, it feeds into a bit of a wider debate around Emery that I've sort of felt myself not at the centre of, but I have experienced backlash from some Aston Villa fans on social media for saying that 3 years ago I didn't consider Emery an elite manager. I consider him a very good manager. Now, I do stand by that, but it's based on, I suppose, the definition of what elite is, which, I mean, is essentially the absolute top. And it's very specific in sporting terms as well, because elite, we're talking about winning the trophies that everyone is aiming for, the absolute major honours. I mean, you're talking about the wealthy clubs, given how stratified football is. We are talking about the major league titles and the Champions League. Emery really has neither. He does have one league title to his name, but that was Ligue 1 in France in 2017-18 with Paris Saint-Germain, who had just embarked on what is still the most lavish summer spending spree ever seen. They got Neymar and Mbappe. And that was, of course, after Mbappe's Monaco, when Mbappe was a teenager, beat Emery's PSG to a title. And those 2 seasons with Paris Saint-Germain form his the only 2 seasons in a 22-year career where he's finished in a top 2. Now, look, none of this is to disparage Emery. I suppose I think it's interesting in the context of this discussion, because one of the reasons. I mean, look, I'm sure people watching this video are probably screaming at me now. Well, the reason he doesn't have this record at the higher level is because he's been at clubs of lower resources. But that's part of it. Ultimately, given what they saw at Paris Saint-Germain, given what they saw at Arsenal, but I think that's a little bit more forgivable given the issues Arsenal were having at the time. A lot of major sporting directors, a lot of major clubs, now some of them obviously aren't all that functional, but many are. They haven't seen Emery as an elite manager in that way, someone that can take them to that level. And there's a perception of him, I suppose, as someone who can take a club up to a certain level, but maybe can't go beyond that with the wealthiest clubs. Certainly 22 years of evidence of his career shows that so far, but it's not over yet, not by a long way. Villa are doing well this season, so let's say he may well outperform his wage bill this year, especially given Villa had to basically sell without buying much in the summer. All this, of course, feeds into something bigger about football as well, which is just, and I touched on this at the start, these are elements that people don't like to talk about, basically. It feels like it takes away from the magic and the romance of the game to be reduced it all to an equation in this way. but it is more relevant than anything. And this is where issues like, this is why fans are talking about balance sheets and accounting terms like amortization and PSR all the time. And like Emery came out with an interesting point on Sunday after they lost to Everton, like a defeat which does feel quite symbolic in this season as well as significant. And he said, I think there was a bit of mistranslation here, but he was talking about how, we're not contenders for top 5. I mean, ultimately he's right though. They shouldn't be, because they don't have one of the top 5 wage bills. And that does point to something bigger in football that I've long argued for in Independent. Usually the argument within football circles is this should allow more investment, that financial rules should be loosened. I would actually argue in the opposite direction. We should have more restraints, but the issue is the amount of revenue the top clubs make, which this Deloitte Football Money League showcases. Basically, there should be better redistribution in football to give a fair chance, as was the case for most of English football history, or at least some sort of player restriction rule, so more of the talent is spread around. So it's not just about how much you can pay, because at the moment, as we've seen for the last 15 years, it is making football more predictable, and hence we have to look at kind of minor variations in lists like this to have these sort of discussions. From that, the City thing obviously isn't a surprise, given they had a difficult season last year, but let's see how it goes now, because they're in the middle of poor form right now. Chelsea, I suppose, would say they're still stabilising and they are doing things in a different way, as I've discussed in previous videos. And Liverpool, despite the pure basic numbers here of them being first in the wage bill list, albeit with some caveats, and first in the table last season, it's obvious overperformance. I mean, first title in 5 years, and just being a champion, winning the league, as Arsenal are now finding out, it does come down to something different than just the process or the product of a list in that way. There's a difference between getting close to the line and getting over it. And if you do the latter, it is overperformance in that way. But yeah, I do think this at the moment, lists like this, as dry as it seems, it obviously, you can see from the reaction, probably see the reaction to some of this video, that it may seem dry, but it drives quite a lot of animated and emotional discussion about football. So if you've enjoyed this discussion, please remember to like, comment, subscribe, all of that, and I'll join you next time for more Miguel Delaney's Inside Football. You can also subscribe to my newsletter. We should have a link in the bio too. Thanks for joining me.